Hello, geographers. Welcome to another A Level Geography podcast. And this one is on the diverse places, case studies, and examples for A Level Human Geography. So, diverse places is a topic which covers a lot of places given the name. And therefore, it is very difficult to have all of the examples and case studies in one of these sessions. So, what I've done is covered the main case studies and examples from this topic. So a quick reminder that case studies are all about location, impacts and management, social, economic, environmental and political issues, and also evaluating and assessing whether those impacts and responses were valid or not. And all of your case studies are really useful for 6, 8, 12 and 20 mark questions, particularly on the Edexcel A Level specification for geography. And unlike at GCSE, you need multiple case studies in your 12 and 20 mark answers. So these are only the main case studies that we're going to cover now. And you may have some other examples that you used in lessons. Please do continue to use them as well. So our first example is of UK population change. So there's a map on the right-hand side there, which shows you the increase in population in the different regions of the United Kingdom. Now you can very clearly see that London has the highest percentage increase in population change. But you can also see that the patterns there, that the south and the southeast have higher percentage increase changes than the north and west. So England is Europe's most densely populated country. Urban areas, about 89% of the population live in those in England, and only therefore 11 live in rural areas. And the population of the UK has gone up by over 10 million people in the last 50 years, with the fastest rate of increase in the last 15 years. The current population today, as of 2021, of the UK is about 67 million people. So one of the examples we looked at for this was London, and we've seen that London has seen continuously rising migration, national and international, people coming from rural areas around London and also other countries around the world. And as well as that, World War I and World War II played a role as well. It has a vastly expanding economy. Life expectancy is good and increasing, and there are job and educational opportunities for people to take advantage of in London as well. And so that may explain why London has seen continuously rising population over and above the UK's national average. And let's just take a contrasting area, which is Devon in the southwest. Devon's seen a large number of people move into retirement, urban-rural migration related to this, lack of services, people migrate out of Devon to places like London. There's been increased tourism, though, in the area of Devon. It's a sandy coastline, and people owning second homes down there for a simpler, more relaxed lifestyle when they retire or go on holiday. So that's an example of how the UK's population is changing. Now, as part of the Diverse Places unit, you have to look at a mixed rural area and a remote rural area. So your mixed rural area is North Yorkshire, and your remote rural area is the Highlands. So let's start with North Yorkshire as a mixed rural area, has a population of just over 600,000, and mostly rural, remote uplands, and it loses young population due to migration to bigger cities. It has a predominantly older population. It has got some smaller towns and cities, including Harrogate and York, and they're increasing in population size due to people moving into those areas from the surrounding more rural areas in North Yorkshire. But international migration doesn't really have much of an impact on North Yorkshire, and particularly places like Harrogate and York, and it makes up less than 5% of the total population. So that's a mixed rural area, which has a mixture of very rural and remote places, but also towns and cities. Then we have the Scottish Highlands, and the Highlands is the largest UK county, but it has one of the smallest UK cities in Inverness, and it's very sparse with a low overall population of just over 230,000 people. Accessibility is a major issue in the Highlands to the rest of the UK. The economy is largely based on traditional agriculture, farming, and some tourism. And the biggest factor affecting the population here is outward migration, of course. So people moving from the Highlands to nearby cities, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Inverness, and so on. So there are two examples of places that are mixed rural areas and remote rural areas. Your next example then was of an urban area, looking at fertility, mortality, and immigration. And we chose to look at the Newham Borough of London. And you can see the graph on the bottom left here. We have a graph showing you population size as a percentage in the different age categories, along with the London average as a line graph. And you can see very clearly that Newham's population is youthful. It has a higher young population than the London average. And its elderly population is smaller than the London average. So overall, Newham has quite a youthful population. It has a fairly high fertility rate, therefore. There's a baby boom currently, and a 25% increase in population size as well. Newham has seen progress with falling mortality, mainly due to new medicines, better healthcare, new technology, and of course the NHS in Newham has led that way. And that's why the elderly population, although lower than London currently, is starting to rise. Migration has had quite a large impact on Newham, especially because it's near London city centre, which has plenty of job opportunities. 55% of people who live in the borough are now also known as non-UK born citizens. So population does play a major role here when looking at immigration, and it's clear that immigration has had an impact in Newham. So a major part of the diverse places topic is looking at your local and contrasting place. Our local place at Samuel Whitbread Academy is Shefford, and our contrasting place is therefore Luton. Luton being about 15 miles from Shefford. So you, as part of this local and contrasting case study, need to look at a number of different features of the population and gather as many statistics and data as you can. And what I've done here is summarized very briefly into unique features, economy, social, and influences and management, what the populations and areas are like. So let's start with Shefford in Bedfordshire. It is a large village. It's surrounded by hills and agriculture and greenbelt land. It's low density on the rural-urban continuum. It's connected mainly via A roads to conurbations such as Hitchin and Bedford, and it's in a corridor of growth in terms of population and housing. Now, Shefford's economy is mainly one where people go out of it to work. So people commute out of Shefford mainly to work. The local jobs in Shefford are mainly in education and some lower skilled retail services. There is some seasonal work, but it's not large. Unemployment is low at 3.6%, lower than the national average. There's no major tourism industry as it's so isolated, but it is very affluent. The high street, however, does have a pocket of deprivation, where 40% of that population are classed as deprived. Socially, 90% of Shefford's population is white British. Now, that's above the national average very slightly. That is a high proportion. And then 5% of Shefford's population is European. So that means 95% is European and white British. And 2.4% is from the Middle East. So ethnic tensions are very low in this area because ethnic diversity is also very low. There's no social enclaves here. It's not culturally diverse. Deprivation, as I said earlier, is also low. 20% of Shefford's population have a level 2 qualification, which is above the national average. Average house prices in Shefford are £343,000, which is much higher than the national average. And 75% of the homes in Shefford are owned or mortgaged, which again is much higher than the national average. And finally, the influences upon Shefford and its management. So immigration is low, as we said, and it doesn't really influence the area. There isn't really social clustering or tensions. Accessibility is only via road to Shefford. There are no trains. There's only a local bus service. So it's not very well connected. Central Bedfordshire Council has approved new housing developments surrounding Shefford, but minimal building in Shefford. So that may have an impact in future, but not in Shefford itself. It may be external forces having an impact on Shefford. Broadband connectivity is generally quite poor compared to the UK average. There are signal and speed issues due to its isolation. And there is generally what's called a close-knit community in Shefford as well. So that is your local place study. Now, our aim is to eventually compare that with Luton. So Luton is a large town. It's surrounded by many villages and smaller towns. It's very high density. It's connected to the A1, the A6, the M1, railway, National Express to London, and it also has London Luton Airport, which is a large hub for tourism and migration, mainly to European destinations. Luton's economy mainly sees jobs in manufacturing and services, and many travel 20 minutes by train also to London for financial sector jobs. Household disposable income is around £15,000, which is lower than that of Shefford. Unemployment is around 6.4%, which is higher than the national average and higher than Shefford's at double the rate. Tourism is quite large in Luton because the airport is accessible, but Luton is a largely deprived area with some pockets of affluence. The High Town being the poorest area, where about 65% of the people living there are classed as deprived, and often jobs in Luton are low paid as well. Socially, 25% of Luton's population is white British, which is very low compared to Shefford. The EU migration population is high, particularly Eastern European. Ethnic tensions are high. There is high amounts of diversity. There are some social enclaves. And a lot of the services in Luton are tailored to the ethnic background. So the shops, for example, like Polish shops. Deprivation is, as I said earlier, up to around 65% in High Town, and 12% of the population have a level 2 qualification, which is 8% lower than in Shefford. The average house price is £272,000, and 48% of people own their own homes. Again, that is much lower than Shefford's house price and average ownership percentage. And finally, looking at influences and management, the biggest influence in the last 20 years on Luton has been immigration, with clustering taking place, particularly in the town centre. There have been tensions between Luton-born residents, white British residents, and other ethnic minorities over access to services and faiths as well. Accessibility, though, is very good. Infrastructure and housing development is at a high level, and there has been more and more recent council investment in the area surrounding the airport for new housing, new connectivity from the airport to the main train line, and so on. And broadband technology and connectivity is generally excellent. And generally, you can describe Luton's population as being quite segregated, not that close-knit feel that you get in Shefford. Okay, let's move on to our next example, and this was the impacts of globalization on London and New York City. So two major cities and the impacts, both positive and negative, on those two cities. So let's start with London. London does benefit massively from globalization. It's had mass regenerations of the London docklands. It has Canary Wharf being formed, which is an exemplification of globalization. Exists because globalization exists. There are 800,000 jobs forecast this decade up to 2030. in business and finance services in mainly the London Docklands and Canary Wharf as well. But there are some problems. There is a large population of low-paid workers in London, in insecure jobs, and some illegal immigrants as well. There is what's called an hourglass economy in London. So there are more rich and more poor than most cities around the world. So there is a large divide between the rich and the poor in London. And East London has the UK's highest unemployment rate. Now, when we take a look at New York City and the impacts of globalization on that, New York City is home to 800 fashion designers, proving and providing well-paid jobs. High-end services have benefited from world trade. New York City is a global city. Modern communication systems and the decline of tariffs and trade barriers have enabled better access to world companies, and that is all as a result of globalization. However, there have been more manufacturing jobs lost in this state than any other state in the US over the past 40 years. And that's due to outsourcing to other nations. The median incomes in the state have fallen lower than that of the national average as well. And there are clusters in the city that have a relatively small share of a high educated workforce. So there is a small amount of very high educated people that cluster in New York City. The next case study was of industrialization challenges in Victorian London. So the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century gave birth to many of the UK's larger cities. Urban areas grew due to massive rural-urban population and migration. And that's still happening today. So we need to look at the negatives of urban living in a Victorian era in the 19th century. So overpopulation, overcrowding, poor living conditions, poor sanitation, lack of healthcare. Air pollution from industry of coal and chimneys, water pollution from raw sewage in the Thames, cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and influenza as a result of the above problems. Life expectancy was circa 37 years old. Now, compare that with today, life expectancy in some London areas is up to 82. And it was basically seen as a dangerous place in terms of safety. There was prostitution, drunken violence, and general disruption in everyday life in London during the Victorian era. Now, there were some solutions to these problems. So in 1829, the Metropolitan Police established to deal with criminal activity, and that's when the Metropolitan Police began. In 1870, we also had the construction of a proper sewage system in London, which is the one still in place today. And London's West End has been improved with the building of Piccadilly Circus, for example, and Regent Street area. And so these things over the late 1800s and early 1900s began to become more modern as they are today. So that is your case study for the challenges of industrialization in Victorian London. Now, one of the major case studies in this topic as well is Cornwall. And for Cornwall, we look at, for this part, perceptions of living in a rural area. We will come back to Cornwall later as well to look at how the area is managed. So we have to look at the positives of living in Cornwall and the negatives of it. Feel free not to use all of these. These are just some I have listed. So it's a beach location. It has beautiful scenery. It's sparsely populated, not overcrowded. It has super fast broadband. It was one of the first areas in the UK to have it. It was a pilot area. It has its own sense of identity in terms of Cornish pasties, 60 different types of cheeses, Cornish wine, Cornish ice cream, and so on. It has its own language too. It has high quality housing with lots of space around it. And its climate sees more sun on average than the national average. So 1,640 sunshine hours a year compared to 1,450 in the UK average. So they're all positive. It can also be seen as a negative place to live. It's remote. Travel time is high. Really, car travel is really important in this area. The climate sees some frequent storms and high rainfall in winter due to it being seaside. A high amount of erosion along the coastline there, particularly at the Dawlish coast in Devon, where there has been income losses for tourist industries. There's a lack of social opportunities, and that has led to a youth or a brain drain. There's limited services too. Tourism has a poor reputation in the summer in this area. It makes the area very busy, very loud, in places like Newquay particularly. And there is poor access generally to healthcare facilities. Only 38% of West Cornish villages have a doctor's surgery. So there are the positive and negative views of living in Cornwall. Now, just a bit on its population characteristics overall, then, as you can see from the population pyramid, it is an elderly population mainly. It's mainly retired people and families that live in Cornwall. And you will find that teenagers, the youth, ethnic minorities are less attracted to the area. And in fact, you can see in the 20 to 30 age category, there is a dip in population, partly because of a fall in fertility rates, but also because of rural urban migration. These 20 to 30-year-olds moving towards places such as London and Brighton. And finally, there are some major challenges in Cornwall, and I've mentioned some of these already. So the brain drain, the young, well-qualified people leave the area towards bigger conurbations and cities. Seasonal, low-paid and part-time work is abundant, and job security is low. In 2011, Cornwall had the lowest full-time annual average earnings in the UK. So the average person in Cornwall in 2011 earned the lowest amount out of anyone else in the UK on average. And there has been a decline in industries like farming and milk pasteurization due to competition and cheaper stocked goods from abroad. And that has forced farmers to switch to other means of farming like arable farming. Another major case study in this topic, and a really useful one, has been the London Docklands. And this is an area experiencing evolution or change over time. So why did the London Docklands need regenerating? Now, we mentioned the London Docklands earlier in relation to Canary Wharf, and that's really what's come out of this regeneration. So the London Docklands was a dock until the mid-1900s, when containerization by Malcolm McLean, that idea was brought into force, and also the impacts of globalization. And that led to a rise in unemployment, up to 21% by 1981. It led to derelict buildings and wasteland, and also inadequate transport links. So the area really needed a new identity and a new role in London. So how is it regenerated? 4 ways: housing, community, transport, and the environment. So the London Docklands Development Corporation, or the LDDC, was in charge of all of this regeneration. It built 50,000 new homes since 1981 and 8,000 local authority homes or council houses. It's also, along the Royal Docks, built 9,000 more homes in a Silvertown urban village. The LDDC essentially spent £20 million on the environment and community projects like local parks and gardens to give it a community sense of feel. In terms of transport, it had major investments. So the Docklands Light Railway opened in 1987, costing £73 million. Operates a full service from Canary Wharf to Lewisham. We also have the London City Airport just on the edge of the London Docklands there. And that opened in 1987 too. And that handles 4.3 million passengers a year from 188,000 when it opened in 1987. And there has also been improvements to bridge access and road access in the surrounding area as well. Finally, £300 million has been spent on improving utilities and improving the general area in terms of pathways, parks, and so on, just to make the general environment better. Now, the key players in this regeneration were, of course, the LDDC. They attracted the investment, they made the physical changes, and they improved the community as well. The UK government funded the plan and backed the LDDC and granted the planning permissions for the LDDC to carry out the work. And Transport for London is another major player in this, as it implemented the DLR and the Jubilee links. Was this regeneration then successful? Was this change and evolution successful? Well, Docklands now does contain some of the largest world banks like HSBC and Barclays. It has 14 million square feet of office space and retail space, attracting more and more businesses all of the time. It's seen as the financial district of the world. And those employed in the Docklands rose from 28,000 to 105,000. So definitely there are three major successes to this regeneration scheme there. However, one of the major failures of this regeneration scheme is that it did push out the older community from the early 1980s who lived there, who lacked the skills for these new high-tech jobs, who were former dockers or miners who lived in the area at the time and who could no longer afford to live there. So those older residents were slightly pushed out, and the provision for them wasn't as good as it was beforehand. Now, another example in London was the example of ethnic segregation. And this is about Russian oligarchs. Now, this is quite a short, simple one. This is just an example of how ethnic segregation can take place in a city. So some Russians in the upper socioeconomic groups, the richer Russians, are attracted to places like Kensington and Chelsea, the richest suburb of London. The reason they're attracted, the pull factors, are essentially that there's a Russian embassy nearby. It's an expensive and an exclusive area with shops that meet the Russian enclave, Russian-based shops, and things like Harrods as well. London's very important in terms of world entertainment and theatre. There's private schools in the area. Moscow is nearby, a 4-hour flight away. There is major money to be made from British property investment that's proven really fruitful over the last 30 years. So there are all the things that create ethnic segregation in a place like Kensington and Chelsea, and the pull factors that bring Russian oligarchs to London. Now, another case study here was to look at a very diverse area that has historic tensions and issues. So we looked at Southall. Now, Southall has been through quite a lot of change. In the 1960s, it's seen a decline in manufacturing, and in the 70s, it's seen race riots. In the 1980s, it saw a large riot of white supremacists against the Asian community. And today, there is a 55% Indian population in Southall, and many of the services in Southall are tailored to those people. So the white British population believe crime has increased since Muslims and Sikhs have been living in the area over the past 40 years. Muslims and the Sikhs are disliked by the white British population in this area, or have been. White British people in the area have believed that the police have not acted on these crimes, and there is a sense that the culture of Southall has been lost over time in the area. So there has been some redevelopment and investment in Southall to try and solve some of these tensions and issues, including £7.7 million from TfL, Ealing Council and the Mayor of London. Improvements to public spaces, creating safety, reducing car use, increasing pedestrianisation. And there is the Southall Big Plan by the local council to build 4,000 new homes, which is currently underway. And finally then Crossrail, which is the major New London route being built in central London, is due to be connected to Southall to further connect Southall to central London. Now, has again Southall and its tensions been successfully managed? Well, congestion has been a major problem in Southall and was a major problem. The train station was reconfigured, the junction around it was reconfigured, and signage has been changed to try and reduce that problem. There has been complaints from residents as well during the investment phase about their deteriorating deteriorating health due to the building works. In terms of an area with historic tensions, Southall really is very different today than it was in the 1970s and 80s. Because it has a majority population that's Indian now, and there are other populations of other ethnic backgrounds, tensions have declined, but social enclaves in some cases have also increased. Another case study, which is a multicultural area, and managing that multicultural area, is Slough. So, Slough has a population of 145,000 people. Its population increases around 15% every 10 years. 35% of the population is white British, and 16% of the households do not speak any English. There are three stakeholders in Slough's development and management. Let's start with the Borough Council itself. So, Slough Borough Council has aimed to improve the housing, employment, and the environment of the area, and it's currently developing 3 housing areas with 200 homes, 29 new council rented homes, and a cultural learning centre called The Curve for adult education, and a new sports stadium as well. So, Slough Borough Council is investing heavily in the area to try and improve the infrastructure of the area. There is also a community group called Edexcel. Now, Edexcel is a Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu charity that helps to resolve tensions between the different types of communities in Slough. It promotes conflict resolution. It basically aims to resolve conflict. And one of the ways it's doing that is by training primary and secondary school pupils the skills they need to resolve conflicts and to live inclusively, to live in an area that is a wide-based community that has multi-ethnic ethnicity at its core, that has multi-faith at its core, that is a multicultural area. And finally, the local economy. So TNCs have played a major role in Slough and its economic success. TNCs have established their offices in Slough, and they're things like Nintendo, O2, Mars Bar, and so on. Slough Aspire is a partnership between companies and local council, and that aims to improve the employability and skills of the local people by training them up. So TNCs and companies in Slough are also trying to build relationships in the local population community to try and train them up for the jobs of the future. And so that is 3 stakeholders in Slough and how they are trying to manage a multicultural area. Now, I mentioned we would come back to Cornwall earlier. So we looked earlier at Cornwall and the perceptions of a rural area and the negatives and positives of living there and so on. But we also need to look at how a rural area is managed. So there are a number of strategies for rural development that have taken place in Cornwall. One major one was the Eden project in 2001. Essentially, you can see a picture on the top right there. It's a project of 2 large conservatories or biomes promoting sustainability and sustainable living. Cost around £140 million, most of which came from EU funding. Now, that has brought many benefits to the area of Cornwall, including £2 billion for the local economy, with 20 million visitors in the last 20 years. It employs 450 people and has seen tourism in the area increase. However, it has also led to traffic congestion problems in the area. And because of the economic crisis of 2008, right through to 2015, in 2012, there were staff cuts due to a decline in visitor numbers. And some visitors of the Eden project have complained that a cost of £25 for a ticket is a bit high. Another rural development strategy, and I mentioned this one earlier too, is superfast broadband. So Cornwall was one of the first places in the UK to receive superfast broadband, and it was funded directly by the EU, British Telecoms or BT, and also the Cornwall District Council. It cost 132 million. In 2016, over 95% of the residents had access to superfast fibre broadband. And this has encouraged businesses and the knowledge economy, where all of the wealth is created, to invest in Cornwall as well. And finally, we need to look at the stakeholders in managing this change. So who is it affected, who has an interest, and who has been involved? The EU. The EU has been granting Cornwall funding since 1999. And in fact, Cornwall is one of the places in the UK, along with Wales, that has a net gain of EU funding over the past 20 years. UK central government continue now to provide grants to develop the area today. In terms of local government, NHS Cornwall is the area's largest employer today, and since 2010, Cornwall Council has had no startup funding from the government to be able to invest in projects, so it's relying solely on national government projects at the moment. Tourists, of course, are a stakeholder in Cornwall, and demands have led to better infrastructure overall. As tourist numbers have increased over time, there has been better connectivity via road and railway as well. And finally, the farmers that we mentioned earlier when looking at Cornwall have been demanding for quite some time now greater economic expansion, the ability to further expand agriculture in the area, and also other sectors as well. So that is looking at how we manage a rural area like Cornwall. And that covers most of the examples and case studies you need in the Diverse Places unit. I hope you found that useful. Please do go and check out the other GeogPod for Human A-Level Geography and case studies in terms of globalization, and there is more to come. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next one.